Hi there. Thanks for clicking the link. I was doing that one good thing for a while, and it was exhausting. I ended up dealing with a knee injury, so I haven't been doing that, and I'm sorry if you liked them. Um, but everything changes in life. So this character, Mattias Desmet, you probably know him or have seen him. I talked about him a couple years ago when I first found him. And he went in front of Senator Ron Johnson's hearing Monday and had something to say. He put out a statement that was important on itself, and then he gave a little talk, and I'll put that video at the end of this. But I think it's important to read the statement and then look at a couple sections of it because we're not out of the weeds. And we have work to do as individuals and as a group. And so anybody that listens to this, you're dialed into being truthful and honest and sharing things and trying to help humanity, clearly. I know most of you. And that's your jam. So this is going to be a little longer video, but I think it's something we need to look at. So, pardon me. His statement is a written statement, I guess he submitted. And it was going to be his speech, but he went on to something else, which is equally important. I'm just going to read it here. Somewhere back in the 17th century, humanity embarked on a courageous project. Until then, it had relied on mythical and religious narratives to organize society. Now it would leave these illusions behind. Science relied on the world as it appears before our eyes. It objectively described phenomenon and rationally described relationships between them. This approach to life was expected to be a royal way to truth and to liberate humanity definitively from the dangerous illusions of religion. The era of enlightenment and reason was about to begin. A few centuries later, this expectation turned out to be an illusion itself. The tradition of enlightenment all but led to the reign of truth and reason. Never before, the elites relied more on a manipulative style of speech called propaganda. And never before, people followed so blindly even the most absurd narratives distributed through the mass media. Kant believed the tradition of enlightenment would produce a new citizen who would think for himself, but until now, the opposite turned out to be true. It produced the ideal citizen for a totalitarian state, which Hannah Arendt defined as a citizen who cannot distinguish between reality and fiction. After the communist and fascist totalitarianism of the 20th century, we currently witness the emergence of a technocratic and transhumanist totalitarianism. It manifests in the typical way totalitarianism does, a diabolical pact between the elite and the masses. The elite is situated at the level of the global institutions. The ideological program of these institutions, as it is articulated, for instance, in the UN Sustainable Development Goals, is imposed to public space through an impressive propaganda apparatus. To give one example, the UN recruited in 2020 no less than 110,000 so-called digital first responders to fight disinformation on the internet. The rationalist view on man and the world also had some unexpected psychological effects at the level of the population. The focus on rationally understanding the outward appearance of a phenomenon alienated people from inner experiencing and the ethical dimension of life and disconnected the human being from its fellow human beings and from nature around it. These two evolutions, the emergence of an elite that uses propaganda and a lonely and disconnected population, reinforced each other. The lonely state is exactly the state in which a population is particularly vulnerable to propaganda. In this way, a new kind of masses or crowds emerged throughout the last 2 centuries, the so-called lonely masses. The process of mass formation makes people radically incapable of taking a critical distance of the narratives spread through the media. It makes them radically willing to self-sacrifice, and it makes them radically intolerant for dissonant voices. Think about the aggressive censorship of dissonant voices during the corona crisis and throughout the 2020 U.S. elections. As society falls prey to propaganda, it becomes even more clear that there is an urgent need for what the ancient Greeks called parrhesia, or sincere speech. From a psychological point of view, it can be argued crystal clear that truth speech both inhibits mass formation, and hence also totalitarian system they are based on mass formation, and the root cause of mass formation, which is disconnected and loneliness. This is the point I make. It is time for a metaphysical revolution, a revolution which essentially, at the psychological level, boils down to this: the switch from a society ruled by lonely masses in the grip of propaganda to a society guided by a group united through sincere speech. So, we are a group united through sincere speech. Not because I'm the leader, because those of you who know me, I'm not that, but anybody who makes content, who watches this channel, and you guys know each other, you are a group united through sincere speech. We were a little bit abused. You get videos taken down, you put work into stuff, and then the powers that be, the elite, who are connected through everything, they don't like it, so they take it down. But you keep going, right? And you reach out, and you build friendships. And part of what I think is important in here is this really applies to most all of our communal issues. People feel disconnected, and you don't feel like you're heard, and you don't feel like you have any say in the matter. And that's an illusion. Because whatever difference you make in whatever conversations you have, it's very important. And that can be at a gas station. You have no idea the ripples that go through the pond when you throw a pebble in a lake. That little tiny pebble will go all the way across the lake. I mean, don't matter how big it is. And so I encourage you to double down on whatever you think you need to say, because from knowing everybody who's here, you guys have good things to say, truthful things to say. Sincere speech, that you have no vested outcome. You're not invested in the outcome. You just see a thing as it is and you say it. And that's super important. So keep that up. The other part that I think is important is when we look at our political systems, we're limited. We seem to be limited in our choices. So you get this guy or that guy, and now there's a third party guy that maybe has a chance that you might really like. But even inside of those, the same thing that he's talking about is going on. And I'm going to read this part again. As a society falls prey to propaganda, it becomes even more clear there is an urgent need for what the ancient Greeks called parrhesia, Parrhesia, or sincere speech. When we look at those people who are alleged leaders, and people love Trump, but if you're honest about his past, he's not on your side at all. He wants power. He doesn't care about you. And you can look at Operation Warp Speed, and you can look at his business dealings, and don't choose the lesser of two evils. And I'm not saying the other team's any good. None of them are good at that level. But sincere speech about that is that you don't need those leaders. You live your life. You make your choices. I think it's time to push their political nonsense out of our heads, far away. And if they make policies that affect our lives, then we can deal with it down the road. But to worry about it now, or even think about it, there's a gun control bill that's supposedly coming in Colorado, and people are pissed. They're gonna try to get rid of all semi-automatic anything. And my brother-in-law asked me about it, and we were talking about it. And in the back of my mind, I'm like, so what? If they do it, I'm not getting rid of mine. And if they come and get them, we're gonna have a problem. But that problem doesn't exist right now, so it's not worth getting upset about. I don't think it is. It doesn't seem like we can stop these things. So until enough of society does what Mattias Desmet recommends, which is to have a metaphysical revolution, a revolution which essentially at the psychological level boils down to this: a switch from a society ruled by lonely masses in the grip of propaganda to a society guided by a group united through sincere speech. Anyone who's doing sincere speech, you know when you hear it, you know they're telling the truth. Stick to those people and build with those people, including each other. So that's about all I have on that. I'm going to put this video up. Hopefully it stays up. But if it doesn't, it'll be on BitChute and Odyssey and Rumble. Thank you for your time and attention, as they say. Love to hear what you have to say in the comments. If you made it this far, you're a champion, because most people watch a minute and a half. So to all you savages out there, see you next time.
Move on to our next presenter, Dr. Mattias Desmet. He's a professor of psychology at Ghent University. He has a PhD in psychology and a master's degree in statistics. He is currently investigating the psychological effects of propaganda. Dr. Desmet.
Thank you, Senator Johnson. Unlike most of my colleagues here, I didn't really focus, or not so much focus, on the question what they were hiding. I rather focused on the question how it was possible that so many people refused to see what they were hiding. And in the beginning of the crisis, I studied the statistics a little bit, and I immediately got the impression as a statistician that, for instance, the mortality rates were overrated by a factor 10. And a few months later, by the end of May 2020, it was actually clear for everyone who wanted to see it that indeed the mortality rates had been dramatically overrated. Like in a small country such as Sweden, the initial models predicted that over 60,000 people would die if the country didn't go into lockdown by the end of May 2020. And the country didn't go into lockdown, and only 6,000 people died. And then even like the people who built the initial models in a hearing for the British House of Commons admitted that the mortality rates had been dramatically overrated in the beginning of the crisis, and still the story continued as if the models had been right. The media continued to disseminate the same narrative, and the people continued to buy into it. And that for me was the moment when I decided to take the perspective of a mass psychologist and to try to show the people what psychological mechanisms could explain how an entire society was in the grip of a narrative which was utterly absurd. And the more I studied these psychological mechanisms, the more I noticed that what we were witnessing was the emergence of a fully fledged totalitarian system in our society. A totalitarian system which is always based on what Hannah Arendt called a diabolic pact between the elite and the masses. You need two things for a totalitarian system. On the one hand, you need an elite which excessively and relentlessly uses propaganda to keep control over the population, and then you need a part of the population, 20 to 30% usually, to go along in that propaganda and to buy fanatically into the narrative. And we've seen, I think, both components of a totalitarian system in this crisis. And I think, like, if we want to know what we can do against such a totalitarian system, then it's crucial, I believe, to really understand and to feel what psychological mechanisms are at work, both at the level of the elite and at the level of the population. In a nutshell, I believe that what is crucial to understand how such a phenomenon can happen is that a society of the population should be isolated, should struggle with lack of meaning-making, should be anxious, frustrated, and aggressive. And if under these circumstances propaganda is used, then there is a good chance that propaganda which disseminates a narrative in the population which offers an object of anxiety and a strategy to deal with that object of anxiety, a virus and lockdowns, for instance, then there is a good chance that the anxiety in the population will attach to the object of anxiety in the narrative, and that a major part of the population will be willing to participate in a strategy to deal with that object of anxiety, even if the strategy is utterly absurd. And it's like perfectly comparable, it's identical actually, to hypnotic state and to prevent the hypnosis. To go deeper and deeper and deeper, you need some people, not too much, some people who continue to speak out in as sincere and truthful way as possible, and to continue to do so, even if that means that they will lose a lot in the world of appearances. And I hope and I'm confident that there will be enough of us who will continue to do so.
Dr. Desmet, in your written testimony, you talked about the Enlightenment and how science was going to prevail and lift humanity out of despair. Eisenhower, in his farewell address, talked about the dangers of public funding of science and how it produced an elite group of scientists and technologists that are going to drive public policy. Seems like that's kind of where we're at, and it's that elite group that has been driving public policy and quite honestly have been driving the propaganda. Can you speak to that at all?
Yes, of course. I believe that what we've witnessed throughout the last 50 years, I think, is a radical perversion of academic discourse. In the beginning, science was a pure example of truth speech. It was the discourse of a minority who went against a majority and who risked everything to articulate that discourse in society. But slowly, as science became the dominant discourse, it got perverted, as usually happens when the discourse, a truthful discourse of a minority, becomes dominant. And just before the corona crisis, the academic world was in a terrible state. We often forget that, but like 15 years before the corona crisis, we've seen the replication crisis in the sciences, showing that up to 85% of the academic papers, for instance, in the medical field cannot be reproduced, and that many of them are fraudulent. And so that was the background, I think, against which like an entire academic community could collaborate with this narrative that seized control of society in the most destructive way imaginable, I think.
So what drives that fraud? I mean, is the grants, is the funding coming from a source that's going to want a particular outcome of the research?
Funding is one thing, but it is not everything. There's something else as well. Something is a more profound psychological factor, which is indeed, funding is definitely not everything. And I know that because like in the academic field of psychology, funding doesn't play a major role. But still, most studies cannot be reproduced and many are fraudulent. I think we have to see it as money is important, but there is something more important. And it is this rationalism, I believe, that is typical for the Enlightenment tradition. The tradition of Enlightenment replaced the religious view on man and the world by the materialist view on man and the world. And it started to believe that a rational understanding should be the guiding principle of our society, rational understanding rather than ethical principles. And that was a fundamental mistake. Such rationalism, as it is, for instance, conveyed by people like Yuval Noah Harari now, such rationalism, in the end, always lapses into radical irrationality. And that's what we are seeing now, I think. We are seeing how a world marked by the hubris that a rational understanding could be the guiding light of not only individual human existence, but also of human living together in general. It just proves that the state we find ourselves in now proves that rational understanding can never grasp the essence of life, can never be the ultimate guiding principle of a society, and that in the end it has a dramatic effect that people lose all ethical awareness. And that is exactly what we have seen in every totalitarian system that emerged, whether we are talking about Nazism, communism, or the contemporary transhumanist technocratic totalitarianism. It always starts from the idea that on the basis of rational knowledge, a new paradise will be created. And as Hannah Arendt said, the only problem with this totalitarian paradise is that it looks suspiciously like hell.
Thank you, Dr. Desmet.